such a complex issue: race, media, the death penalty, and the Unabomber's case. And I've never been asked to put all those pieces together before, and I might be a little incoherent because it's new to me, but there's an incredible synergy of these various issues, and I hope to draw it out in talking about my own experience and my friend's experience. The death penalty should have ended for two very obvious reasons, if not the third. We've had so many wrongful convictions. We have always suspected that the system is fallible. Now we know it's fallible. In New York alone, we've had 7 exonerations of people wrongfully convicted of murder simply in the last 5 years. Now those were 7 ironclad exonerations by DNA. We've had 7 others, including one man who was in the Dominican Republic at the time the crime that he served 15 years for was committed in the Bronx. We've got a system that is a mess simply in terms of do they get the right person. We've also got a death penalty system that is extraordinarily expensive. In New York, the figure we often use is that we've spent $200 million for 9 years that resulted in putting 7 people on death row. Nobody was executed. And that's a conservative figure. There are costs to the prosecution and the police that can't be broken out unique to a capital case. It's probably more like $300 million wasted regardless of your opinion on the death penalty. This was obviously a failed program. Look at a state like California where, according to the Los Angeles Times, the cost of the death penalty system over the last 30 years divided by the number of people executed, 13 people, comes out to $250 million per execution. $250 million to put someone to death. Even if you were for the death penalty in principle, if you had no moral objections to it, you'd have to think, wow, there's a whole lot better ways to spend our energy and resources. And even if we were only focused on crime, working with troubled kids, working with crime victims, working with the mentally ill, any number of programs we could do to strengthen communities, to reduce the levels of violence. Instead, we've been pursuing, for political reasons, a program of vengeance that, for the most part, doesn't work in any case. But now to the third reason, because that's really the subject, and that is the disparity in how the death penalty is applied. Go back to 1972, the Furman decision, the court, under the wise leadership of Thurgood Marshall, noticed that we had tremendous disparate application of the death penalty. Some of it was arbitrary. Most of it we know was not arbitrary. It had to do with class, and a lot of it had to do with race. And made this enlightened decision, looking holistically at this justice system and saying, if you're going to take someone's life, you have to do it in a way that's fair. We have not come close to that. We don't have a system for doing it. The death penalties should be ended. And I think most of us felt at that point that this was the end of the death penalty. Unfortunately, a different court, you've heard earlier today about the McCluskey decision. And if you think of the absurdity of that decision, basically it says, we know we have a biased, unjust system. It was a biased, unjust system that put you on death row, but now you have to prove that it was personally biased against you. Something strangely counterintuitive about that kind of an argument. And yet you could understand their motivation, because if McCluskey had gone the other way by 1 vote, say if Lewis Powell had come to his illumination a little bit earlier, we would not have a death penalty today. And we are stuck with a system, 1,000 more executions, families, including families of victims, continually re-victimized by a system that doesn't help anyone. One of the things I used to hear in New York constantly was that, hey, we're not Illinois, and we're not Alabama, and we're not Texas. We're going to do things right in the state of New York. Well, we've done a better job. We don't have a death penalty right now. We had assembly hearings in 2004 and 2005 that looked at the whole issue and said, look, there's a lot greater downside with the death penalty than there is an upside, which is, speculative, if any. But if we look at how the death penalty was applied in New York, there were disparities. You heard that in Baldus found in Georgia that the murder of a white person was 22 times more likely to result in a death sentence than the murder of a person of color. Nationally, that figure is pretty much thought to be about 4 times more likely if your victim is white that you're going to get the death penalty. Well, we did do better in New York. According to the Center for Law and Justice in Albany, over a period of 10 years that we had the death penalty, you were only about twice as likely to get the death penalty in New York State if your victim was white. We had a system that nobody could argue was applied evenly. So in a massive state with 19 million people, 62 counties, almost half of our death row, 3 of the 7 people sentenced to death in New York came from one county. Now, you would imagine that would be a high crime county, right? It must be a lot of murders in this place. Well, it was Suffolk County that put almost, half of our death row, a relatively low crime area by standards of urban New York. And I'd like to just think for a minute about one of the men who were sentenced to death there, a man by the name of Nicholson McCoy. You think all white juries are a thing of the South or a thing of the past or just happened in Chicago with its particular brand of racism. Nicholson McCoy was convicted of a rape and murder. I don't think there was any question of innocence, at least it was never raised to my knowledge. But he was the only black person in the courtroom throughout the trial. The attorneys on both sides, the jury was all white, the judge was white, the witnesses were all white. Everybody involved in the case was white except the defendant, Nicholson McCoy, who happened to be a very, very large black man. Another thing unique about Nicholson McCoy's case is that of the 7 people sentenced to death in New York, he probably had the strongest case of mitigation. At the age, and it was well developed by his attorneys, who were really good attorneys. At the age of 4, he witnessed his father being murdered by his mother. His mother went to prison. He went into the foster care system. He was removed from foster care families twice on grounds of abuse. When his mother came out of prison, when he was in his early teenage years, he was replaced back with his mother, who then abused him again. So consider what a jury's asked to do. They're asked in a capital case to do something absolutely unique. They're no longer finders of fact. Once they have found the person guilty, they're really put in a position where they're playing God. They're asked to weigh the mitigators against the aggravators. Okay, an awful brutal crime, an awful brutal childhood. How are we going to weigh this? And with what tools are we going to weigh justice in this case? And I would argue that in a case like this one, in any capital case, it's really empathy. It's really hard to kill someone once you see they're a human being. So the question is, this jury, did they see the hurt little boy who saw his father being murdered, who was abused continually throughout his life, who was never protected by society? Or did they see the big black man who had raped and murdered the white woman? In some sense, who knows? Did racism put Nicholson McCoy on death row? We'll probably never know. But the picture does not look good. It does not look healthy. It does not suggest, given what we know about how the capital justice system has worked all around the country, like a fair and just system.